I had a significant responsibility both to my superiors and to my fellow detainees to ensure that not a single crumb was taken from their already meager rations. My daily routine was as follows. At 4 a.m., I would distribute bread to the women who came to me, since the storeroom was located in the women's area. At 7 a.m., I would release the food for the hospital, followed by the food for the security personnel, who also collected their supplies from this storeroom. After that, the three of us in the storeroom team would begin cutting the bread, which was the most challenging task. Each morning, the chief accountant would give me lists for each brigade, as the bread portions differed based on the work each person did. For example, a typical brigade had 25 people. The brigadier received 1 kilogram, followed by 5 portions of 1 kilogram each, 8 portions of 800 grams, 6 portions of 500 grams, 3 portions of 400 grams, and 2 portions of 300 grams. In total, there were 10,000 people in the camp. The men were housed in a different part of the camp, separated from the women's area by a barbed wire fence. The entire camp was enclosed with barbed wire, with guards always stationed at the 4 corners. At 6 p.m., when the brigades returned from the fields, it was my responsibility to distribute the bread. I was provided with a platform cart, along with a horse and a helper. We would load the large baskets, each one containing the specific bread portions, and then deliver them to the brigadiers based on the list I had received from the chief accountant. Each bread had to be weighed. We could barely manage to keep up, especially since we were cutting the bread by hand. In winter, the bread was often brought from a bakery 7 kilometers away, and it was so frozen that we had to thaw it on a stove before we could cut it. At 5 p.m., I also had to distribute the food for the camp kitchen, again based on a list provided by the accountant. I would return from the men's section around 8 p.m. and then cut the bread for the women so it would be ready for distribution at 4 a.m. following the same procedure. We would cut bread until midnight or 1 a.m., then completely exhausted, we would get 3 to 4 hours of sleep in the barracks. The cleanliness had to be impeccable, but with the limited time we had, the 3 of us couldn't keep up, so I resorted to using some shortcuts. Even though the men's area was separated from the women's by a tall barbed wire fence with closely spaced strands, births among the camp population were frequent. Pregnant women and young girls received special treatment. After 6 months of pregnancy, they were taken off work, provided with better food, and were not required to work for 4 months after giving birth. Despite the improved food, it was still insufficient. These women came from backgrounds of theft, burglary, and even serious criminal offenses. I would select 10 of these women, lock them in the storeroom overnight, otherwise they would have stolen everything, and provide them with what they needed for work and food. By morning, everything would be spotless. This arrangement worked well for both them and me. I did this twice a month. The camp commander was amazed at how clean we managed to keep things, unaware of my method. The women also washed the white coats, so we were always in pristine condition. Aside from the hard and demanding work, there was another major issue. Every 3 months, an unexpected inspection team from Moscow would arrive. They would enter the storeroom, review the ledger, which was a detailed record of all transactions, and begin weighing the sugar, lard, oil, flour, and butter. Any surplus found could lead to imprisonment, whereas a shortage was preferable, as it could be accounted for with natural compensations. Over 2 years that I was responsible for the storeroom, I encountered only one case of discrepancy. Everything turned out fine, except for a discrepancy of 700 grams of noodles in a storeroom valued at 2 million rubles. The camp commander never attended the inspections himself. Instead, he would first take the inspectors to his office and keep them engaged in conversation for about an hour. Meanwhile, I was notified to be prepared. Initially, I was nervous that I didn't know what to do, but I eventually got used to it. I became very meticulous in my work, always ensuring that everything matched the records. What was with the 700 grams of noodles? I didn't realize it at the time, but it turned out to be exactly the amount a security officer received for his family for a week. The inspection team was on the lookout for any discrepancies and was very pleased when they found something. A huge uproar followed, with threats of an additional 5 years in prison, accusing me of trying to steal and sell the noodles, but failing to do so. I remained silent, knowing I was innocent, and believed that God was on my side. Just then the camp commander happened to pass by the storeroom, and hearing the noise came in. He saw me, trembling and pale, and asked the inspectors what was happening. A major from the commission reported my crime to him. The commander then addressed me with a stern voice. "Have you gone deaf? Don't you know those noodles are my portion, which my wife, not knowing where to store them, left here?" Although this wasn't true, who would question someone like him? Everyone fell silent. The commander then addressed the inspectors. "Is there anything else?" When they replied, "No, we're going to close the report," the matter was swiftly resolved. The fear and anxiety I felt when they came to inspect the bread storeroom, which was separate from the other storeroom, were intense. They weighed 50-60 portions of bread at a time, but everything was accurate. In the final year, I faced a major issue during another inspection. The inspection team included a young woman around 18-20 years old, a member of the Communist Party. After a thorough check of the bread and the storeroom, they found nothing wrong. However, just before leaving, the party member noticed a small lime stain on a woven basket containing pork products. The girls had cleaned up, applied lime, and as usual, when wiping it off, a stain appeared. The party member started shouting at me, accusing me of being a criminal intent on poisoning the detainees by coating the basket with lime. She kept shouting, 10 years in prison. A cook from the nearby kitchen ran to alert the commander that I was in danger. The commander arrived immediately. I was crying in a corner while the party member, with a triumphant look, pointed out the stain on the basket to him, demanding a 10-year prison sentence for me. The commander, very upset, came up to her and, with a mocking tone, asked, "And where did such a clever person like you come from?" She replied, "From Moscow." "Then tell me, how are dishes disinfected in the kitchen?" She fell silent. "Don't know? Let me enlighten you. With chloride, which is made from lime. And what you're seeing here isn't lime, but just a small stain that appeared after wiping off the lime. But you have nothing to say about the cleanliness you found? That's not how you decide a prison sentence. Learn to judge properly before doing inspections." The two inspectors with her were embarrassed and quickly left, and she followed suit with her head down. The commander then came to me, patted me on the shoulder, and said, "Don't worry about anything as long as Ilarionov is around." In the end, everything turned out fine. I was reported to the chief once more. The camp had a nursery run by a Jewish woman who was a staunch pagan, while the staff were nuns with whom I was friendly. The Russian mothers were very devout and complained that their children were not baptized. At that time, some priests had died, others had been sent to different camps, and only one, who was quite fearful, remained. When the mothers asked him to baptize their children, he refused, fearing it might lead to another prison sentence. One day, a nun from the nursery approached me and said, "Let's baptize the children. It's a sin to leave them unbaptized. The Church teaches that if there is no priest available, a Christian can perform the baptism in an emergency, provided they have holy water. You recite the creed, immerse the child in water 3 times, say the baptismal formula, and the child will receive the right to be called a Christian." I agreed, but we had to wait for the right moment when the Jewish director would be away. One evening the nun came to me and said, "Hurry, come quickly. Our director has gone to the cinema." The nuns set everything up in the kitchen, bringing each child to me one by one, and I performed the baptism ritual. There were 35 children under the age of 1. Many were woken from their sleep and were crying, confused by the sudden activity. Afterward, having completed the baptism, and with my own work still waiting, I left. When the director returned, the nursery was still filled with crying children, and she sensed that something unusual had happened. She began questioning the nuns, and since they weren't accustomed to lying, they admitted the truth, that the children had been baptized and that I was the one who had done it. The Jewish director already had a grudge against me because I would sometimes visit the nuns in the nursery, where we would spend our free time reading spiritual texts or singing. She, filled with malice, couldn't stand these gatherings. She often told me outright that I wasn't allowed to enter the nursery, which wasn't true, as I had a right to go anywhere as the person responsible for the storeroom, especially to check on food supplies. I ignored her and never greeted her, which only made her more of an enemy. Now she saw her chance to get revenge. As soon as morning came, she went straight to the camp commander, since she was also a detainee, and reported that I had baptized the children in the nursery. She demanded either that I be put on trial for religious propaganda, or given another 10-year sentence, or that I be transferred to another camp. She was furious and determined to get rid of me. The camp commander, after calmly listening to her, one of his strong traits, seriously asked her, "Weren't you baptized?" Caught off guard, she responded, "How could I have been baptized?" He said, "It's a pity you weren't. You might have been kinder and more at peace." Then he added, "I'm not going to punish her at all. She performs her duties flawlessly, and what she does in her free time is none of my concern." The commander later recounted this to me, laughing, as he couldn't stand that woman either. Shortly afterward, he had the nursery transferred to another camp, saying he couldn't afford to maintain the children, who cost 30,000 rubles a month. I also had another frightening experience. One winter evening around 6, I was getting ready to deliver the bread to the men. The cart was loaded with baskets, and the driver was waiting for me to head out. Suddenly the commander came in, visibly agitated, and told me, "Tonight you won't be delivering bread to the men. Give it to the women, and tomorrow morning you'll give it to the men." I was surprised by this sudden change, but didn't dare question him. I followed his orders, though I could hear the angry shouts of the men wondering why they weren't getting their bread. The next morning, instead of the usual delivery time at 4, the cart arrived at 6. Along with the driver, 3 guards came and stayed with me the entire time until I completed the task. I spent the entire night and day puzzled about what it all meant. Then at 4 o'clock the commander came by and laughingly said, "Did you know that I saved your life?" It turned out that many young vagrants in the camp who refused to work would pass the time by playing cards for stakes. They would gamble away clothes, linens, and when they had nothing left to bet, they would gamble on people's lives. The winner of the bet was required to off the person who was gambled. I was one of their targets. They had planned to off me when I went to distribute the bread. However, one of them, who had a bit of decency, overheard their plan and immediately reported it to the camp authorities, which is why the commander stopped me from delivering bread to the men that evening. During the night, they arrested him and his entire group and sent them away from our camp. The commander told me about it. I expressed my deep gratitude, and he replied, "After being imprisoned as innocent people, it would be a shame to be offed by criminals." Despite the numerous challenges and other issues I encountered over those 2 years, I managed to reach the end of my sentence only with God's help. With just 1 month left until my release, I asked the commander to assign someone to take over my duties so I could train them. He responded, "I was actually planning to talk to you about this. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to continue working here even after your release. You would leave the camp, but I would arrange for you to live in the free zone where we all live. You'd receive 600 rubles a month. You've proven yourself to be honest and diligent in your work." I was taken aback and said, "Sir, I've been waiting for 8 years to go back home. My father passed away 2 months ago, and my mother is alone, relying on my support. I appreciate the offer, but I want to go home." He gazed at me for a while and said, "But what if you're not going home?" "I can't say anything more. Choose someone from the camp to take over your position." As I left, I saw tears in his eyes. However, I was relieved and happy to have reached the point where I could successfully hand over the storeroom. I selected a very devoted and gentle girl, handed over the storeroom in front of the committee, and continued to visit daily to provide guidance. I felt so relieved and free, anticipating going home and reuniting with my mother, who, in her old age, had been left in difficult circumstances. 2 months after my father's death, the collectivization of Bessarabia began, and my mother, being a priest's wife, was among the first to have everything taken from her. She wrote to me saying, "I'm eagerly waiting for your return. I need you as much as I need air." I lived in this anxious anticipation for the next 3 weeks. The day of liberation finally arrived, June 21st, 1949, marking the 8th anniversary of my arrest. 3 of us were being released. We were called to the accounting office, where we received all the money that had been sent from home and deposited under our names. I had 500 rubles. The commander thanked us for our honest work, but instead of giving us our release papers directly, he handed them to a security guard who was standing by. The door opened and we stepped out. We had to walk 100 kilometers to the nearest train station. At each nearby camp, which were about every 4 kilometers apart, we stopped outside while the security guard went in. We rested, and after about an hour he would come back with another 5 people. As we moved from camp to camp, the number of released prisoners kept growing. Eventually, we started wondering why we were being escorted by guards. Some thought it was because we didn't know the way, while others believed it was to ensure nothing happened to us on the long journey, given that we were unfamiliar with the area. After 3 days, we finally reached the train station, a group of 300 people, both men and women. We were expecting to be told we were free to go and buy tickets wherever we pleased. But to our dismay, a train arrived, and the 6 guards accompanying us ordered us all to board it. Confused and scared, we asked where we were being taken and why. What happened to the freedom we had fought so hard for? But the order was strict: silence and obedience. We traveled by train for a whole day, and by evening we arrived in Novosibirsk, at the train station of this city in the Siberian region. After that, we were unloaded and transferred to trucks that took us to the Novosibirsk prison. When we entered the room, we found 30 desperate women already there, just as liberated as we were. They began questioning us about what we knew and what this situation meant, but we didn't have any answers either. This time the regime was more lenient and the food was better. Every morning when the security guards came to inspect us, we asked them what their plans were for us now that we were supposedly free. They shrugged and admitted they didn't know either. After 5 days, someone more compassionate told us, "You have the right to request a meeting with the prison chief, and only he can tell you the truth." When they asked who wanted to request a meeting, everyone was too scared, so I stepped forward. The next day, at 10 a.m., a security guard came and escorted me to the prison chief. I entered the office feeling anxious. A Russian security officer, with a stern and displeased expression, was seated in front of me. "What do you want?" he asked. With the courage that I felt was a gift from God, I replied, "I want to understand why we are being detained. We just completed our sentence, having committed no crime, and now we are being imprisoned again, without any reason." He smirked sarcastically and said, "Yes, I will tell you. The international situation is very tense. Even though you have been in a correctional camp, you are still considered enemies of the people. We cannot release you back into society, so the government has decided to isolate you permanently in another part of Siberia. Forget about your countries, get married there, and start new families." He then asked where I was from, and I told him I was from Bessarabia. With a sharp tone he declared, "You'll never see it again." He continued, "We're keeping you here for a few days to gather enough people for a district. Then you will be sent to work in the collectives. We have no interest in feeding you like parasites. That's all there is to it." He then summoned a guard who took me back to the room where 59 women were waiting eagerly. I shared everything with them, and there were so many tears and sighs that I believe even the walls of the room were shaken.